Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Monica Jacko and I am Equality, Diversity Inclusion Lead here at Cambridge University Hospitals. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome and introduce our guest speaker this evening, Hashi Mohamed, as our talk as part of our week of events to celebrate Black History Month. Hashi will talk and then there will be an opportunity to ask questions using the chat box. Before I hand over to Hashi, I would like to say a few words of introduction. Hashi Mohamed is a barrister in number 5 Chambers, based in London, specialising in planning and environment law. He is a broadcaster and also an author, recently publishing last year his debut book, People Like Us, What It Takes to Make It in Modern Britain, which explores his experience of social mobility in Britain, having come to the country as an unaccompanied child refugee, aged 9. David Lammy MP said of Hashi's book, Hashi Mohamed powerfully exposes the alienating and segregating effect of social immobility in this country. Beautifully written, People Like Us makes a deeply personal case for a world in which anybody can reach success, but doesn't have to leave a part of themselves behind to achieve it. In today's session, Hashi will share his experiences of growing up in Britain and facing the inequalities that exist in our society, what inclusion means for him, and what more he thinks can be done to challenge inequality and develop more inclusive behaviours. I heard Hashi speak at last year's Hay Literary Festival, and having read your book, Hashi, I felt compelled to invite you. And speaking to you last week, we found that you also have a personal connection with Adam Brooks, that your wife used to work here. So without further ado, I will now hand over to you, Hashi. Thank you, Hashi.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Monica, and thank you to the University Hospitals for having me this evening. And thank you everyone who's tuned in at this time to listen to what I have to say. So as Monica was just speaking there, I think one of the things I wanted to set out before I got into the details was just I'll speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then I'd be very keen to open this up to you all in terms of a question and answer session. You will appreciate that, of course, it is Black History Month, and this is one of those events, and I love the background that you've got there, Monica. It's very colourful. But hopefully the topics and the issues that I'll be discussing and the points that I'll be raising are beyond just the month that we're dealing with, and the issues are similarly much more widespread and much more of a concern for society as a whole. So a little bit about me. I'm a barrister and I'm a broadcaster, and I recently wrote this book called People Like Us, What It Takes to Make It in Modern Britain. And that is the kind of thesis around this issue based on partly my own life story, but also based on a sort of an analysis of social mobility in this country in a very wide-ranging kind of way. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a moment. As Monica was explaining, I was born in Kenya. Both of my parents were Somali, and we arrived in the United Kingdom in the early 1990s as refugees, alongside many others around that time. So our starting point in this country wasn't remarkable in that sense. Although for us, it was a culmination of tragedies that took place around the same time. One of this war that was raging in the country, and which coincided with the death of my father when I was 9 years old. My mother, giving birth to 12 children, was also left behind in Kenya as we travelled to the United Kingdom with relatives that we had just met. And this also meant that my family as a whole had been scattered around the world. I have brothers and sisters living in North America, many cousins who ended up in other parts of Europe. And we ended up in this country in 1993 without any understanding of culture, without any understanding at all of the language, having just gone through a traumatic experience of war and death, and then also having arrived here without your mother. And so you can imagine, or possibly not imagine, just how much of a burden and difficulty that is for a 9-year-old child to arrive in that context and then try and make sense of a hugely difficult period of time. And before I go further in terms of understanding what that means and how then I overcame some of that, I thought I'd read a short passage from my book, which talks about social mobility as a whole, people like us, but in particular, just how important those early years are. And I'm sure that, as many of you have you will appreciate the part of the analysis that is often missing around social mobility relates to how significant it is in terms of where you are born, to whom you are born, and crucially the quality of environment that you have in those very, very early years, and how that can set the tone direction of travel for you, for your family, and for whatever social sort of attempt you want to make in society. So this is the passage that I wanted to read from the book, and it goes a bit like this. Your early years set the course for the rest of your life, a course that is extremely hard to correct later on. And deprivation begins in the womb. Children born into poverty are more likely to be born prematurely, and are more likely to have low birth weight and receive less nutrition in the womb. All factors associated with poorer future health. They're also at a higher risk of infant mortality. They're more likely to have mothers who suffer from postnatal depression and stress during pregnancy, something that can affect the way in which their genes are expressed. As babies and young children, they often live in inadequate housing and are part of families that struggle to afford enough food and heating. Stressful situations that rewire their brains to make them anxious and jumpy. So you can see already the way in which we have society set up, and we can see already how much of an impact those early years can have on someone's trajectory, someone's life chances, the quality of your early environment can really be so determinative. And the reason why that is important is because they're often obsessed around education and social mobility, and why Oxbridge institutions are not recruiting wide enough and sort of diversely enough, often sort of having these bizarre debates at the periphery of these issues, without fundamentally understanding what has actually taken place so far earlier in the stage that you might well be in, that then sets the course of that person's destiny. Of course, there's, again, as I say, book, very hard to correct, but can be so critical for later years. So that's the sort of first area of theme. But coming back to my own trajectory, I then went on to study law and French. I went on to Oxford for my postgraduate studies on full scholarship. I went on to become a barrister after the training, which was also paid for through scholarships, and then qualified as a barrister a little over 9 years ago now, and have been practicing in that field of planning and environment, which is taken across the world and also across the country in terms of the areas that are of interest. And so that's a truncated version of the story and how that has come about. But you can imagine also just how an impact those early years have had and how much of a turnaround it has been for me when so much was standing in the way. The next theme that I wanted to touch upon in terms of life lessons was around the role of education. I'm sure many of you listening to this will have been told at a very early age in your life that education is key. Education is the answer. It is the only way in which you're going to succeed. If you don't have the right qualifications, if you do not take your education seriously, if you don't really focus on aspiration and education, then the course of your life is highly unlikely to meet its full potential. Now, all that is true, but reality is education and its impact on your life is not as much as we give credit for it. In other words, I don't think that when we think about the issue of social mobility in this country, the weight that is placed on the shoulders of our education system is not a weight that it can carry. And that is down to a number of factors. First and foremost, education is important. If you are living in a civilized society, you need people to be able to read and write, to be literate and numerate, and to be able to actually function effectively in their societies, to know what a bill looks like, know how to pay a bill, understand how you can contribute to their communities, and so on. But the reality is that when it comes to becoming socially mobile, and what do we mean by that? We mean relative mobility as opposed to absolute mobility. Relative mobility is the simple idea of if your parents did not have a professional qualification, for example, and you are now, for example, somebody who's professionally qualified, you have become socially mobile relative to your parents. But the reality of where we are as a society today is that if you are in Britain and if you have all those qualifications, it does not necessarily follow that you will become socially mobile relative to your parents. It just doesn't bear out. And so what does that actually mean in practical terms? What it means is that there are so many other factors that are at play. Factors such as social and cultural capital. What does that mean? Cultural capital is the language with which you speak, the accent with which you communicate, the cultural references that you might have. Monica mentioned the Hayes Festival. Now, if you've never been to any of these literature festivals, for example, I certainly had never been to a literature festival until I was presenting my book. I've been to the Cheltenham Literature Festival a couple of times. None of the ones that I was presenting the book at, ones that I would have accredited, or the kind of cultural references that people might have to Shakespeare or other sort of cultural ideas. These are the kind of cultural capital that one has to be able to allow somebody to distinguish themselves from a crowd of people in a society that is often referred to as suffering from grade and university degree inflation. And so cultural capital is that bit extra that can really neither really be taught properly through the state education system, nor if you do not have the right parents to be able to sort of almost inculcate that into you through osmosis and indirect ways of communicating that. It is a huge gaping hole for people like me and for those who are not necessarily come from a particular background. Social capital is the connections, the people who introduce you to the right people at the right moments to be able to help you carry forward those opportunities, to be able to get the right mentor, to introduce you to the right individuals at the right moments. Somebody who can tell you about an internal job that's come up that may not be advertised externally, somebody who might be able to help you with the interview technique. I did a similar interview for the post that you're about to go for, and these are the questions that they had asked. This is how you might want to answer those. Those are the sort of social capital you might have at your disposal, or your parents might have at your disposal, to give you that extra edge, to give you extra opportunity to get ahead of that particular crowd. And so coming back to the analysis on this particular point, education is absolutely essential for anyone seeking to advance their lives and how to do things. But frankly, education in of itself is not enough. There is so much more needed. And I delve into more in the book and how that bears out. The next sort of big theme that I wanted to touch upon is just how much we are obsessed as a society with particular narratives and particular ideas about social mobility, about race, and so on. And one of those is this simple notion that we live in a meritocratic society that will meet you at your destination, and that all you need is to essentially work hard, put in the hours, and you will succeed. Well, that's just simply not true. We don't live in a meritocratic society. We don't live in an environment in which the people to whom you are born is something that you can choose, nor is it an environment in which everyone is actually treated almost as an equal, as a starting point. And if that sort of basic foundation of accepting that we do not live in a meritocratic society, then everything that flows from that has to be questionable and frankly also unacceptable as a premise. Because if we don't accept that we are living in a society that is not meritocratic, then it's obvious and it must follow that if you, no matter how hard you work, no matter how determined you are, no matter how talented you may be, there are so many other blocks that you will need to clear along the way in order to become successful. And those are the blocks that we've talked about in terms of social capital, the cultural capital, the right types of qualifications, the right people in the right moments, so on and so forth. And so when we talk about meritocracy and we say to young people, look, you'll be fine. You just have to work hard. You don't have to worry about success. It will come. We need to be careful. Of course, we don't want to be telling young people at school, you live in a society that is deeply unfair, don't bother, it's never going to work out for you. We don't want to do that. Of course we don't. But we as adults, and at this stage, we're serious about living in a more equal society, living in a society in which everyone has a genuine, fair chance at succeeding. We have to confront this basic reality. And that basic reality is that we are in a fundamentally unequal place where so many kids are growing up without equipment. Just during the whole COVID process, we discovered how many children were having to either share computers and equipment, or had really poor internet connections, or are fighting for the right sort of attention at the right moment in their homes, and were being left behind, as opposed to other schools, public schools that had personally sent laptops to each and every single one of the kids' homes. That inequality that is fundamentally at the heart of our society is where we are struggling to cope. And if we do not get ahead of that, then the pieces of the puzzle are going to be resolved in a meaningful way. And I will tell you about, for example, health inequalities and how that manifests itself as part of the wider picture and how that works in terms of understanding. The next sort of theme that I wanted to talk is around understanding what is actually feasible and what can we actually do. And what I mean by that is, if you talk to any parent, particularly parents of minor backgrounds, if they're recent immigrants, my experience certainly, and I'm sure many of you too, they often just start with the notion that you want your kid to be a lawyer, a doctor, a sort of possibly academic, possibly an accountant, but it's sort of like those 4 or 5 jobs that if you don't meet one of those, somehow you are a failure. And that's linked to our understanding as a society of what it means to be successful. And the trouble with that is that we are then setting up a huge amount of people and a huge amount of children for failure, because what they will have done is they will have internalized as a starting point in their lives that if they don't become a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, whatever other tiny job spec that they've looked at, then they will not amount to anything. And so how we understand success, how we understand what it means to be successful, how we approach this question of becoming what you deserve to be rather than what your parents think you should be, is a fundamental problem for our societies. This book came out last year in the middle of the pandemic. Cut my mind back to the time when people were going out of their houses on a Thursday evening to bang pots and pans to say thank you to the NHS. That's all long gone now, isn't it? They aren't really talking too much about those things. But I wrote this book 2 years before that. And this is what I said about the jobs that are needed by society but are not necessarily remunerated in the way that they should, and what that says to us about society. So bear in mind, what I'm talking about here was 2 years before the pandemic, and then bear in mind what you saw last year on a Thursday evening outside our houses. Reducing income inequality, after all, takes some of the pressure off the precarious middle classes by reducing the financial penalty for downward social mobility. We never talk about downward social mobility either. Higher taxes mean better social housing, better schools, more childcare, more libraries, more access to public services, all of which can make a crucial difference to the socially mobile. And higher wages for jobs that are socially important but poorly remunerated, like those in nursing, the caring professions, teaching, and the emergency services. A more equal society is one that gives each citizen space to find their own definition of success instead of a narrow winner-takes-all mentality. We could find something that rewards and sees as a genuine end in itself jobs that support others, strengthen our society from within, where compassion, and generosity are as valuable qualifications as intelligence and drive. For some, happiness will always be linked to material possessions, cars, higher salaries, and exotic holidays. For some, it will be about power and status, but for others, it will be about a happy family, love, belonging, and about making a difference, creating change. We could build a society that values all of these outcomes equally, but we will need to use all of our imaginations. Now, there you can see how much I'm trying to essentially say. Today, I don't need to tell you that a nurse is far more socially valuable than a barrister, frankly, and they will probably work just as much hours, but sadly will never be remunerated in a similar fashion, unless you're a criminal, in which case you're earning less than minimum wage because of the way that the criminal justice system is poorly funded. But the point is about success, but also about how we approach what it means to what you want to become when you grow up. And that's critical because if we continue the current mentality, which is that winner takes all mentality that I talked about, that if you become a banker, a lawyer, a footballer, you get all the spoils, war, and more. But if you decide to be a paramedic, a teacher, in a place like London or in Cambridge, which you know how expensive Cambridge is, you're not going to survive. And that cannot be right. That cannot be right for a civilized society living in the 21st century, whereby we are desperately trying to draw in some of the most compassionate people to the professions and to work in places like Cambridge University Hospital for years on end on research, the things that make us special as human beings. But then you have to worry about living costs, whether you can afford to pay your rent, whether you can afford to raise your children without worrying about finances. And that for me is also what is sort of fundamental, in addition to the points I talked about, the overburdening of the education system, the meritocracy point that I made earlier. That for me goes alongside just how the ills of our society will never be fundamentally addressed until we address these sort of basic mentality outlet points about what it means to be successful, what it means to become socially mobile, how we approach these things in terms of understanding society's needs, how people like us, as the title of my book suggests, see one another, and we don't just remember each other when a massive pandemic rages through and pots and pans brought out into the NHS, but then we move on. So the final theme, the penultimate theme I want to touch on is around luck. Now, luck is something that I'm sure has played a role in most of your lives, but it's something that we rarely understand. We can't measure it, we can't taste it, we can't eat it, we can't see it that well, but it's there. And there's a great professor called Robert Franks at Cornell University who wrote a book about the myth of meritocracy and social mobility. But he's probably to describe luck in a way that I have visualized. What he says, what Franks says is, imagine this is actual imagine you're on a bike, and you're cycling, and you're cycling uphill. And when you pull this function, you are as hard as you can. You feel each and every single mind muscle in work, and going that hill, doing the best, it's physics and nature. That's bad. You are areas, it's a fist, you can do it, you can say, there it is, it's causing you stress. When you take a left or a right, and this is down the climb, going down a hill, you will not notice the fact that you're downhill for about 3 seconds, but you will not notice after that. The wind is behind your back, and you are going down, but you're pedaling, because what's more likely to happen in your brain is you are more likely to attribute what's happening to yourself, to that cycling, the fact that you are cycling that bike down that hill, and you are hardly likely to notice how much things have changed around you, both physically and laws of physics and so on. That's good luck. Good luck is happening to you every day. Good luck is happening to you in moments that you're unable to understand. It's all around you, and you hardly notice it as much as you might notice bad luck. And that's how Robert Frank sort of encapsulates that. And the reason why that's important is then he goes on to talk about this quote that he has in there, where he says, never mention luck in the presence of self-made men. And the reason why that is because when you become successful and you have beaten the odds, you are much less likely to attribute that success, how well you have done, to forces that are outside of control. Because you're much more likely to tell yourself and convince yourself, it's all been me, it's all been how much I worked. But actually, if you are honest with yourself and you really examine your life in a meaningful way, in a really meaningful, reflective way, you will notice the sacrifices that have been made by many members of your family along the way. You will notice the many near misses that have happened in your life that has meant that you've gone in one direction or the other. You will notice that you were very lucky to not have experienced, if this is your experience, to not have, for example, experienced a death, a very monumental and profound death in your family early on in your life, like I did, losing my father at the age of 9. These things that didn't happen, that could have happened, because they happened to other people, so you don't have to imagine them being something far-fetched, but is beyond the realms of possibilities and reality. These things that could have happened, but did not happen, are things that you are more likely to discount, and therefore believe that your trajectory, your destiny, your success, and where you find yourself today is down to you and you alone. And the reason why that's a problem is because when you then go on to tell your story of success, achievements, and distinction, you're telling an incomplete story. And in many ways, it's an irresponsible story. Because those people who will hear it may not necessarily have had that good luck in your life. They will look at themselves and think, I've been a failure. And that's why for me, don't get me wrong, I believe I'm worth where I am today, and I've worked extremely hard. And a huge amount of what I have achieved is down to me, my determination, my talent, my focus, my ambition, and drive. But it is also true, and it would be a folly not to acknowledge, that a huge amount of it comes from so much sacrifice made by family members, so sacrifices made by other people around me, people who believed in me, people who've given me chances when they absolutely didn't have to, people who introduced me to the right people, people who saw me headed towards a pitfall and said, I should take a left. You don't want to go in that direction, and so on and so forth. And so when you think about your life, when you see other people struggling, and you see other people who may not necessarily have the fortune that you have had, just pause and not necessarily think that if only they had worked harder, if only they were a bit more ambitious, if only they were a bit more driven, they too could have got there. That may also be true. But it may also, and more likely true, that that's only half the story. That isn't the full story. And finally, linked with that is the way, again, how we as a society, often when we hear the stories of success, we rarely ever hear those full sacrifices, difficulties, grit, and pains that have gone through people's lives. Instead, you're more likely to hear about Jeff Bezos, who founded Amazon, and look where he is now. Bill Gates, who dropped out of Harvard, and look how amazing he is now. And those stories are absolute nonsense. When you read the footnotes, it should really have been the text. But the text is this bit that I've just told you. But when you read the footnote, it should have been the text. In Bill Gates' case, you discover that his father was the mayor of town. His mother was the most well-connected, church-going, hugely influential woman in her community, who helped to introduce him to various people and helped introduce him on the first computers, and was able to spend a huge amount of time discovering and finding ways of understanding. Now, that is not to take away from Bill Gates' huge talent that when he was presented with that opportunity, he exploited it in ways that perhaps somebody else in that same situation may not have exploited it. If Bill Gates wasn't born in that town in Seattle, to those two parents who managed to do what they did, and instead was born in Baltimore, then his life would have been completely different. But you don't get these details. You never hear these critical parts of the story that are actually so important. That when you only hear that they dropped out and did this, as a human being, the natural reaction is to think, gosh, what have I done with my life? And that's just not fair. Same with the nonsense about Jeff Bezos. His parents gave him seed money of $250,000 in the early 1990s to start up Amazon. And then, obviously, Amazon's trajectory, if you follow it through, happens to coincide very neatly and very perfectly with not only the rise of the internet, but with all of our obsessions of ordering stuff to our houses. So it's no wonder that it is what it is today. I mean, again, I don't want to take from the guy's talent, but if the internet didn't go the way it did, or we weren't stuck at home trying to order stuff, we don't remember Amazon today. So it's these kind of details that matter. These kind of details matter because they don't tell us the full story. And instead, we are given just the snippets that make us all feel inadequate and helpless. Finally, in your environment, Cambridge University Hospital is hugely diverse as an organization. And you have multiple nations represented. But how many of those people who are diverse are actually sitting in positions of influence? How many of those people who are not like middle class, public school educated are actually making big decisions in a huge organization at the forefront of research like Cambridge University Hospital? We're often told about this white peak at the top of the mountain. And that is a fundamental question for you to answer, because it's easy to make a recruitment at the starting ages, but it's a much harder and much more difficult question around the strategic direction that ensures that progression and retention becomes hugely important. And crucially, people joining your organization, a Filipino nurse who's just come to this country, must be able to walk into Cambridge University Hospital and not only see herself as a nurse who's just arrived and who's at the bottom of the rung of the ladder, but she must also have to be able to believe that when she looks up the food chain in a place like your hospitals, she sees a vision and an opportunity that if she does work hard, she meets the metrics and is determined to succeed, she too could be in a position of leadership. She too could be in a position of influence. But that's not the reality where you guys are today. And that is the challenge that I end on. So I'm going to stop there, Monica, and say all questions are open. Please don't hesitate. I'm more than happy to take any questions that you might have. So please don't hesitate to put them in the. I don't know how you're going to do it.
I'm just looking at the Q&A, so let's just see.
If you have anyone who wants to
Erica, what's the question? Erica. Just Erica, do you want to ask it?
No, my name is
Yes.
I am beautiful presentation. As Monica said, my name is Erica. I'm the chair of the Dane Network here at CUH. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day and sharing the time on the line with us. This is not a question, but more of a reflection following your talk. Yeah, for me as the chair of the network, as a black member of the workforce, your talk has just laid more bare the role that the workplace or employers directly or indirectly have on society. If the workplace is not lend itself to support minorities to thrive or achieve general well-being or even up that trajectory, it sets the tone for their children in the downward spiral and for degradation. So I agree with you. What we are doing now for Black History Month in Cambridge University Hospital should not only be for October, but the way we conduct ourselves.
January and April and
whatever season, month it may be, that is the way we should leave that. Thank you.
I really appreciate that reflection.
Tracy Grace Vice Chair Network said, "Oh my God, Hashi, you have such an amazing sense of self."
Tracy, I think got her hand up. Anytime anybody watching the webinar, please do drop in the chats. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's see what Tracy says. Amazing sense of self. Exhausted, Tracy. So I'm glad that's what's coming across the diagram, and so that's tough line. But thanks. That's what you've taken away from this.
No, definitely. And can you hear me? Yeah. So welcome, Hashi. It's absolutely phenomenal to have you here. And also what you said resonated with me. So I'm born and bred in Hackney. I'm also from a single parent family, and all of the stereotypes, all the issues that you raised in your early years and surrounding the challenges, I can resonate with all of them. In a previous life, I was actually helping my career at the bar. I looked at professional law, and I wanted to my background in I wanted to practice the intellectual property. And you probably know intellectual property is one of the hardest sets of chambers.
There are like 2 sets of chambers, and each has probably like 10 people in it. So it's probably one of the most sought after places. So you picked the place that has the niche of the niche.
Yeah, and everything that you said, that's why I ended up not going to the bar. I may not be compromised. I may not be here. If you're here, I offer that's not what I want to do. I'm not going to compromise. So I completely get it. I resonate with it. I just have to on one of the points that you raised about how, as a culture and as a society, linking out with the anti-racism strategies that are on in our organisation now. You know, we have put in place, and we are constantly working together with Monica and the equality and diversity team, who are amazing, and talk about it. Me as a network director, I work with Erica closely, and Neil Brown, to vice chair of the America, the chair of the network, and together with her team, and our senior leadership team, we're our director, we're also Jamil. We're all working very hard to implement a series of strategies that over time overcome the inherent threats of racism to the organisation, impact on the BAME workforce. But I just wondered from you, as you mentioned society as a whole, and I see reflections of that within the organisation that we're working, and the infrastructure, if the organisation itself and the infrastructure and the very senior leadership do not support these initiatives, we almost, as you mentioned, setting ourselves up for failure, regardless of how many great initiatives we put in place.
Very good question.
So what advice do you give, Hashi?
Very good question. So I was just about to speak about that because no matter what Monica is doing, which by the way I have to give Monica a particular kudos and gratitude because she's been chasing me for weeks and she managed to get me down to do this talk. So without Monica writing me, so I'd say thank you to Monica for being patient and for chasing me for the weeks.
She's awesome.
But no matter what you guys are doing in terms of genuinely being interested in how to make a difference, if the senior leadership team, and I mean everyone from the top brass in the hospitals, the registrars, the senior consultants, the non-executive directors, I don't care who, if those people do not buy into the ethos, the aims that you guys are doing, everything that we're here to talk about is meaningless. Everything we're doing here, we announce to nothing more than a talking shop. And I agree with you, Tracy, that you will inevitably be set up for failure. So if you're imaging hospital, which is a bloody, it's a village, it's not just a hospital, it's a village. I know that very, very well, and pretty away. And so I know the area very well, and I just think it's such a huge organisation. But actually, that is also one of its strengths, because it also gives you an opportunity to try out and implement a really good strategic direction on a massive scale.
Yes.
So in many ways, people might think that it's a juggernaut and it's too huge to make fundamental changes. But actually, if you turn it on its head, it actually is a real opportunity to make bigger, more lasting, more fundamentally important changes through this organisation. But to answer your question, Barry, you guys can have as many networks as you like. By the way, I'm not very kind to BAME networks in the book, but that's for you to discover. I don't say anything. You should get rid of them. I do have problems with them. But I still think they have their uses. You can have as many networks as you want. You can have as many diversity inclusion sessions and chairs. But if the people who are sitting right at the top to actually say, we support that, tell us what you want, we'll do it, it's a waste of your time and it's a waste of your resources. And the last thing I'll say on this, you often find, and I work with, and I do talk to hundreds of organisations from completely different backgrounds, everything from consultancy to hospitals to schools to law firms, you name it, to co-ops, you name it. One thing that really interests me and I've noticed that I'm trying to develop is when the BAME networks or diversity inclusion drives, you often find, one of the way exceptions is, not entirely, what you often find is that people who are involved in these initiatives are usually at the start of their careers. They're usually at the start of their careers, they're usually at the bottom of the rung, quite often minorities themselves. And that, when I say minorities, it's not necessarily black and I mean black, it could be working class, it could be first generation university, but they are minority people in some shape or form. And what's really difficult, what's really also really interesting at the same time is that person should concentrate on how they go up the ladder. Because their equivalent doing the same job, who might be white or plus, all they've got to concentrate on is to do it well and get promoted and get promoted and get promoted. But their equivalent, like Hashi Mohamed, is being asked to get involved in the BAME network to do these events. All time, resources, and emotional capital.
Oh my God. Hashi, we discussed it today. I'm not thinking you, Neil, and Clear and I, when you like instant after 13, you were with us, honestly, we literally for them expressed exactly that today.
That's interesting because the point is, Tracy, why should the burden be on you? Why should you have to carry that burden? You should be concentrating on finessing your craft, getting better at your job, training yourself and growing professionally. Instead, you're being dragged back. And I don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing that you're doing because in some ways, Tracy, people like you and Monica weren't doing it. I'd rather have people like you guys with the best intentions doing something than not. But at the same time, I'm thinking, why should you carry this burden? Why should you be the ones having to, it's a really good point. Why should you learn to solve the problem that preceded you and will succeed you after you're gone?
Yes.
Be at your doorstep. Now, when you are at that optimum moment of your careers. Then if you're a woman or a minority but at a different level, you've got all that to do.
Actually, it's absolutely phenomenal what you have said. It just resonates to the very core of my being. You know, but notwithstanding, you know, this is a prelude to before we talk about the value in society, how as a society we need to learn to value different professions in different ways in the remuneration. I just feel like if I don't help people, then who's going to help them? And it's exactly there as well.
You know, I have a day job. I can easily just be like, you know, whatever. But I do this stuff, and I do this stuff, and I do it for another organisation. When I do this, I get paid for it. When I do events, I go to speak to schools for free. I send hundreds of copies of my book to schools for free out of my own pocket. And that's because I don't want these kids having to deal with what I dealt with growing up. And then by the time they get to a business university, hopefully, they can make a choice to say, I'm so-and-so today. I have different options to Tracy 20 years ago who was here, because actually I can choose to concentrate on my career. I don't get because I'm better than it, because they don't need, we made enough progress. They don't need, I think that's the point. We're not there, so Tracy, we keep going on and on.
Oh, actually, thank you. Oh, Dr. Actually, thank you.
Actually, I really enjoyed the talk. As well as the people at the top, also meet the private partners that the organisation work with and are connected with. For example, the University of Cambridge. This, I think, is a huge challenge. What are your thoughts on this? And also, once at the top of the ladder, how do people deal with the micro invalidations, aggressions, the micro assaults and insults?
Yeah, so I think on the question about the partnerships, I agree with you for sure. In a place like Cambridge, you know, you have a huge amount of influence and opportunity to collaborate with one of the best universities in the world. And that would be an opportunity. Cambridge is making, you know, quite a bit of progress. Scholarships that are given to a lot of, I think our peers about sort of the masters and the heads of colleges that are coming from minority backgrounds. It's a huge amount of opportunity. On the question of when we're at the top of the ladder and how to deal with those microaggressions and validations, that's a, you know, I'm hoping that that's something that will align itself out in due course. The reality is it's a problem. It exists. You know, that's why interestingly, to just trigger something in my head, Lisa. Interestingly, the book I got attacked. I'm against quota systems. I'm against quotas as a way of dealing with the issues of how we resolve the issue of representation, because I think they make the possibilities and the likelihood of microaggressions happen more, like it's happened less. Because we always have that stupid thing about, you know, you're only here because you're diversity high, and you're only here because, you know, they need more women there or more black people and so on. So I think any ammunition that we take away from those who will wish to insult, degrade, and undermine successful people, we must do more. But I think it's, you know, how you deal with it is a matter of choice. Do you challenge it? Do you ignore it? Do you deal with it in other ways? It's really a matter of personal choice. I wouldn't recommend anyone head put their heads above the parapet if they didn't have to, but it's really a matter of choice. Any other questions? Yes, okay. That's what we call a redundant hand. Legacy hand, that's it. That's a legacy.
Yeah, so like I was saying, working, you know, for the network or, you know, taking the network agenda forward, we are doing this, you know, on 8 desks. Here we are, 6 p.m. After having done some big work, we're going to do more of network work. I think at the times where I question myself and think, second, in the first 10 years, when I was not involved in all this, I, like I said, you know, crafted my skill so well that I got to a certain place. I couldn't go further. But as now that I'm now getting more involved in the network and taking on this, there's a feeling of not being able to do that craft very well, and then you expose yourself so much to the possibility of the network being your poison chalice, as it were, and opportunities for people to say, no, you're actually not doing your primary job well enough, so we'll put you through disciplinary, all those sorts of things. So it's a bit of there is a conflict there.
Yeah, sure, and I definitely see all of that. That's why I always say to people, it's a matter of choice. You know, invest in yourself. Don't die at the altar of diversity. I mean that.
Did you get that, Tracy? And also diversity.
I do, and I witnessed that, and so I'm conscious it's now. Our hour is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica. Anyone else who's on the last chance, because you may not hear from me again, and Monica's made such an effort, it'd be a shame for you to get an opportunity to ask. If anyone else has your opportunity, if not, then I will happily allow you to join. Thank you so much again for having me.
I just have to say we've got 20 copies that we purchased for people like us, which will be soon arriving. This is the purchase.
Thank you. You're probably one. So for the rest of us blends, you can get the paperback, sorry, and most of the hardback.
Last year, and I'm waiting lockdown. I must have lockdown 2, or I think it was. We've got 20 copies. I thoroughly recommend it. Lots of inspiring. The fact that employers' education systems aren't lack imagination, that kept coming up. The importance of, like you say, is so important, and the privilege that we forget. Some of us, that after all fantastic, we as an employer lack imagination in our recruiting. That's some of the messages I want our organisation to take back, and the importance of mentorship. But thank you so much. There's lots of love for you here in the chat. Thank you so much. So, Tracy, it's absolutely awesome, Hashi. So, we'd like a copy of Hashi's book. Please email quality as uk, and they'll be distributed on a first come, first served basis. So, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to those who will see this recording later. And the recording will be live for 30 days, I think. But thank you very much, Hashi, from all of us here at Cambridge University Hospitals.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good week. Thank you.
Bye.